just get stressed. They had nervous exhaustion, neurasthenia, melancholia, and female hysteria. The people, busy, tired, trying to survive the 19th century while being politely crushed by cravats and societal expectations. You're not surprised Victorian doctors were desperate for answers. You'd be too if every third person you met was fainting in public or writing poetry about how deeply sad they were for no clear reason. Enter the age of odd cures. This was the golden era of why not. If it tingled, sparkled, smelled like hope, or had a Latin name, it was medicine. Had a headache? Try electric shocks to the temple. Feeling sluggish? Snort powdered mummies. Yes, actual mummies. Insomnia? Just drink a glass of beef and iron tonic and sleep next to a radium lamp. And if you were a woman who dared to be sad, tired, or assertive, the diagnosis was almost always hysteria, and the cure ranged from long naps to devices I will not describe in a bedtime story. But through all that chaos and questionable science, something quietly sincere began to bloom. Doctors started noticing that not all cures came from glass bottles or loud machines. Some came from quiet, from warmth, from stillness, from lying down near something or someone that didn't demand anything from you, that didn't ask for conversation or improvement, just your presence. And that's where animals wandered into the frame, first accidentally, then intentionally. Cows, especially, offered something rare in the Victorian world: unbotheredness. They weren't glamorous like horses or witty like parrots. They weren't status symbols or circus acts. They were just there, chewing, existing, giving milk, and sometimes, if you were lucky, something much gentler. Permission to slow down. You shift your weight slightly, leaning back on your hands. From here, you can see the doctor again. He's still scribbling in his notebook, occasionally glancing up to observe the interaction like it's the most delicate ballet. You and the cow, synchronizing your breath like old friends or weirdly calm roommates. He believes in this, you. Realize, not in a loud evangelical way, but in the way you believe in warm socks or the smell of bread, things that feel right even if they don't make the science journals. The wind picks up, just a little. The cow doesn't flinch. You, however, remember you forgot to wear proper wool. Still, the ground beneath you is soft, not just because of the grass, but because the moment has started to settle, like tea leaves in a glass, like your thoughts, which have stopped pacing and now lie gently beside you. Maybe that's the first part of healing. Not fixing, just pausing. And if a century full of arsenic pills and vibrating chairs led at least one doctor to say, actually, what you need is to lie down next to this cow and breathe for a bit, well, maybe Victorian medicine wasn't all bad, just mostly. You stand up slowly, brushing dew and curiosity from your coat, and follow the doctor as he strolls along the edge of the field. He walks like someone who's never rushed a day in his life, hands folded behind his back, eyes half-lidded, as if every blade of grass holds a secret and he intends to let them keep it. His name is Dr. James Cowton. Yes, Cowton. You'd think he made it up, but no. That's the name on his diploma, his medical pamphlets, and the tiny brass plate on his front gate, which reads, Dr. J. Cowton, physician of the gentle mind. He never said whether the cows came first or the name did. He just smiles whenever someone asks and says, it all aligns, doesn't it? He was trained like most doctors of his day, a bit of anatomy, a dash of Latin, some enthusiasm for bleeding people when in doubt. But somewhere along the line, perhaps between two too loud heartbeats or a patient who didn't want to talk anymore, he changed course. He started paying attention not just to symptoms, but to stillness. One day, while visiting a cousin's farm, he noticed a curious thing. The moment he stepped into the pasture, the nagging headache he'd been battling all morning simply softened. Not vanished, but quieted. It might have been the sky, or the grass, or the fact that cows do not offer unsolicited opinions about your treatment plan. But Dr. Cowton sat down and stayed there, and by the time he stood up again, 3 hours later, he had the beginnings of a theory. Perhaps the body craves contact not just with nature, but with nature that doesn't rush. Cows, he decided, were the perfect therapeutic companions, large enough to feel substantial, slow enough to never surprise you, and warm, absurdly warm, as if they carried the sun in their stomachs. He began experimenting, quietly at first. A few patients, carefully selected, were invited to his home clinic for bovine field rest. The instructions? Simple. You'll be given a blanket, a low stool, a cup of milk, and a cow. Sit as close or far as feels right. You may touch the cow or not. The cow will decide whether it touches you. There will be no talking. Some patients laughed. Some didn't come back. But others, the ones who stayed, reported something strange. They slept better. They worried less. Their hands stopped shaking. One woman wrote in her journal, "It is as if I have shared my breath with a creature who has no use for panic." Another simply said, "She let me lean on her and did not mind." Dr. Cowton kept notes, of course. This was the Victorian era. Observation was everything, and neat handwriting was practically medicine. He documented the best cow-to-human distance, just under 2 arms lengths, optimal weather, slightly overcast, and the ideal length of session, between 45 minutes and when you forget why you came. He even gave each cow a temperament score from aloofly regal to likes. Neck scratches more than grass, and while the medical journals politely ignored him or occasionally mocked him, he didn't mind because his patients were getting better, not cured, not miraculously transformed, but softer, slower, more themselves. And sometimes that was enough. You walk a little closer now. The cow is watching you again, her eyes unreadable, her presence steady. Dr. Cowton turns, his notebook half closed, and says with a wink, "Diagnosis, overthinking. Prescription, lean and breathe. You nod, and this time you don't hesitate. You settle into the grass once more, only this time with intention. The cow, large, serene, and smelling faintly of hay and something warm and unexplainable, stands beside you like a sentient loaf of calm. You lean gently against her flank. She doesn't flinch, doesn't sigh, doesn't judge your posture or your thoughts. She simply is. And in the silence that follows, you begin to understand what Dr. Cowton meant when he described this as therapy for the nervous soul. Because the Victorians didn't have podcasts or essential oil diffusers or mindfulness apps with rainforest soundtracks. What they had were nerves. So many nerves. The word neurasthenia floated through 19th century society like pollen in springtime. It was the diagnosis du jour for nearly every flavor of tiredness, sadness, indecision, or overwhelm. The Industrial Revolution was speeding everything up. Clocks ticked louder, newspapers printed faster, factories roared, and the human brain hadn't quite caught up. So, while some doctors prescribed electrical collars or cold baths or vigorous horseback riding, Dr. Cowton offered something gentler. He called it therapeutic bovine proximity. Others called it cow hugging. Same thing. It wasn't complicated. You didn't need a degree or a gown or a diagnosis. Just a cow, a field, and permission to not be impressive for a while. Patients were encouraged to breathe slowly, to mirror the cow's rhythm, to match its stillness, to trade the frayed tempo of factory life for the quiet heartbeat of grass-fed peace. And it worked. Not for everyone, but for many. Because unlike humans, cows don't expect you to explain yourself. They don't care what job you have, or how many letters are in your diagnosis, or whether you cried at breakfast. They blink slowly. They chew slowly. They exist slowly. And when you sit beside them long enough, something in you begins to believe that slow is safe. You shift slightly. The cow's side is warm against your shoulder. Your thoughts, normally darting, elbowing, for space, begin to stretch out like cats in the sun. You imagine the doctor scribbling in his notes again. Subject leaned in without prompting. Showed signs of diaphragmatic breathing. Left shoe muddy, but contentment level high. You smile. This isn't a cure, not in the traditional sense, but it doesn't need to be. Because what if, just what if, the treatment isn't about solving anything? What if it's about remembering that your body isn't a problem to be fixed, but a creature to be soothed? And what if the best therapist on the field today has 4 stomachs, no opinions, and eyes like sleepy galaxies? You exhale. The cow exhales too. A slow, gentle synchronization, and for the first time in ages, your nervous soul stops pacing the hallway of your rib cage and simply sits down. Somewhere in the distance, a bird chirps once, then reconsiders. You and the cow remain still, like punctuation marks at the end of a very thoughtful sentence. And then the doctor speaks again, his voice soft but oddly official. "Time to walk," he says. "Not far, just enough to meet the others." You follow him across the pasture, your steps quiet in the grass. Dew clings to your shoes like polite ghosts. The cow follows at her own pace, which is to say, not yours. Over the hill, the landscape changes. You see it now, a small collection of whitewashed cottages, tucked among hedgerows and apple trees. The roofs are thatched, the gardens tidy. Smoke curls from chimneys in that way. Old storybooks always promise, but real houses rarely deliver. This isn't a village, it's a clinic. Well, technically, it's a resting estate for the gently unwell, but really, it's a farm full of people and cows. and absolutely no stress. Here, Dr. Cowton and a few like-minded colleagues began something radical, a form of care that did less. Patients came for weeks at a time. Not to be poked, prodded, or fixed, but to be slowed, to be reintroduced to the concept of days that didn't have to be earned. Each person had their own room, simple, warm, clean. No clocks on the walls, no heavy curtains, just paper-thin, morning light, soft blankets, and the option, not the obligation, to pet a cow before breakfast. Meals were served quietly, vegetables from the garden, milk from the barn, bread from someone's cheerful aunt who believed yeast was a mood stabilizer. In the afternoon, patients were encouraged to do 3 things. Sit in the field, breathe slowly. If a cow approached, consider it an invitation. There were no group sessions, no lectures, no miracle elixirs, just warm bodies, warm floors, warm tea, and warm animals. Dr. Cowton believed healing began not with grand gestures, but with consistent gentleness. And the cows? They took to the job beautifully. Some were cuddlers, others were distant but polite. One named Mabel had a habit of leaning slightly into you, as if to say, "You are not a burden. I've seen worse." A former banker once stayed for 3 months and didn't speak a single word. But on the day he left, he wept. Not because he was sad, but because he finally wasn't. One entry in the clinic journal read, "Today I sat between 2 cows and thought nothing for an hour. It was the best hour of my life." Another said, "My hand stopped shaking the same week Mabel started resting her chin on my shoulder." The medical world mostly rolled its eyes, but the patients didn't. They returned home changed, not in the flashy before and after way, but in the way a riverbank is changed by years of quiet water. You walk among the cottages now. A young man is trimming lavender. A woman with wild gray hair is sketching a cow from memory. She gets the proportions wrong, but the feeling is exactly right. And the cows? They're just cows. Which is, of course, the point. You stop. Close your eyes. Feel the ground beneath. You are solid, generous, unsupervised, and for one suspended moment, you forget every reason you ever believed you had to rush. You're standing in the garden now, not doing anything, just standing, which here counts as progress. The air smells like thyme and something faintly toasted, maybe oats, maybe sunshine. A cow is breathing near your elbow again. You don't turn. You don't need to. Her presence is obvious in the way a fireplace doesn't need to shout to warm a room. You think back to something Dr. Cowton once said over tea and barely buttered toast. The cow's genius lies in her neutrality. You blinked at him, probably with a face that said, "That sounds like something you embroidered on a pillow." But now? Now it makes sense, because cows aren't performative. They're not like horses prancing for attention or dogs, desperate to impress. They don't carry your emotional baggage or challenge your self-worth. They don't mirror you. They just exist beside you. And in their sheer, unmoved being, they create a space where your nervous system finally gets the memo. We are not in danger. Victorian medical theory, for all its quirks and poisons, had at least one insight that still rings true. The body responds to its environment. And if your environment is all clanging clocks, judgmental neighbors, and stiff upper lips, your body will respond accordingly, with tension, trembling, or an irresistible urge to scream into a lace doily. But a cow? A cow is an ecosystem of softness. Her breath is slow, her skin is warm, her digestive system is a 4-chambered lullaby, and her presence says this: nothing here requires performance. Dr. Cowton once theorized that the electromagnetic field of a cow might influence human energy, that perhaps her rumination created a biofrequency that soothed the human heart. Some called that pseudoscience. Others just lay down and felt better. And honestly, does it matter which part worked? The science may have been fuzzy, but the outcome was clear. When humans spent time near cows, gently, respectfully, without expectation, they calmed down. Not in the check your pulse way. In the maybe I don't have to be constantly at war with myself way. You glance over and see one of the patients, a woman who hasn't spoken in 2 days, sitting cross-legged in the pasture, one hand resting on a cow's spine, her face tilted toward the sun. She doesn't look healed. She looks safe enough to start healing. And maybe that's all this therapy ever promised. Not a miracle, just permission. To slow down, to soften, to exist next to something that doesn't require fixing, explaining, or editing. To remember, perhaps, that we are not machines to optimize, but mammals. And mammals sometimes just need other mammals. Preferably large, slow, and wearing a content expression that suggests, I am very good at naps. You exhale again. The cow does too. You're starting to get the hang of this. The thing about cows is that once you start noticing how deeply relaxing they are, you begin to wonder, what else were the Victorians hugging? The answer? Oh, just about everything with a pulse and a vaguely calming aura. You see, Dr. Cowton may have been the unofficial patron saint of cow cuddling, but he wasn't the only 19th century practitioner dipping his thermometer into the warm soup of animal therapy. In fact, animal prescriptions became something of a quiet trend in pockets of Victorian medicine, especially among physicians who thought city air was basically slow poison and that anxiety could be massaged out with sufficient exposure to hooves. Horses were the first runner-up, not for racing or pulling carts, but simply to stand near, to observe, to stroke the mane and feel the heat of their breath. It was called equine grounding. Doctors claimed it stabilized wandering spirits and fluttering internal tempests, which, if we're being honest, sounds exactly like what anxiety feels like. Then came goats. Yes, goats, particularly popular in Switzerland and northern England, where their nimble feet and gentle bleats made them ideal companions for convalescing patients with melancholy or low blood vigor. An actual diagnosis, probably caused by looking out the window for too long. Patients were encouraged to stroll among the goats, feed them sweet herbs, and sit in goat-scented air until they felt fortified. And of course, sheep. There was something about their fuzzy, oblivious nature that made them ideal passive therapists. One London-based sanatorium even built a wool garden, a grassy enclosure where patients could sit, knit, and be among sheep without being expected to talk about their feelings. But still, cows remained the favorite. Why? Because they were big enough to lean on, slow enough not to startle you, and boring enough that your brain could stop spinning. Some doctors even created animal pairings, matching the temperament of the patient with the ideal creature. Anxious? You get a cow. Restless? A goat. Brooding in a poetic way? Maybe a swan, but good luck with that. There were mishaps, of course. A physician in Bath once tried prescribing pigs for patients with anger issues. The pigs were adorable. The patients were soothed, but the smell, less therapeutic. Then there was the doctor who attempted hedgehog meditation for insomniacs. That program was quietly retired after someone fell asleep on the hedgehog. And let's not forget the infamous case of the parrot clinic, where the constant repetition of, "You're fine, you're fine, you're fine," had the opposite effect on already twitchy guests. So no, not all animal therapies were a success. But the movement revealed something during evening tea, never to laugh. Critics worried about professionalism, about the line between doctor and farmer, about the sanctity of white coats. A cartoon even appeared in a satirical paper, a caricature of Dr. Cowton perched on a milking stool, whispering sweet nothings to a cow while a line of bewildered patients waited behind him, clutching their thermometers. It was titled, "Utter Nonsense." He framed it, hung it right in his waiting room. Because here's the thing. Cowton didn't mind being mocked. He minded people suffering quietly in marble hospitals. He minded cures that treated symptoms but ignored souls. He minded a system that thought care had to be cold to be clinical. So he kept his practice small, refused to charge those who couldn't pay, kept the journals open, the cows well-fed, and the pastures soft. And when someone, patient or peer, asked why he clung to something so unscientific, he'd smile and say, "I've seen what this does to people who've forgotten they're allowed to feel safe." You look down now. Your hand rests loosely on the cow's side. She's not moving. Neither are you. And for the first time, you begin to understand the quiet power of being unimpressive, but consistent, because that's what the critics never got. This wasn't about revolution. It was about restoration, about giving people back to themselves, one warm breath at a time. You would think that Victorian society, with its lace gloves and relentless politeness, would have laughed this whole thing off. And some did. There were jokes, of course, whispered behind fans and mustaches, about genteel spooning in the pasture, and whether one should bring the cow flowers on the second session. At dinner parties, it became a kind of low-stakes scandal. Did you hear Margaret went to the countryside to hug livestock? Good for her. She was looking terribly pale, but quietly. People were curious, because Victorian England was a world of performance. A society where everything, from your posture to your pudding, was judged on how well it aligned with the ideal of restraint. Emotions were to be managed. Health problems were to be hidden. Women were to be delicate. Men were to be stoic. And everyone was to pretend they were thriving always. And into that came the cow, not a metaphorical cow, a literal one, offering, in her large, warm, unhurried way, a new kind of invitation. Come as you are. Don't speak, just lean. It started with the working class. Farmers and field hands laughed at the idea that they needed a prescription to sit with a cow. We've been doing that for generations, they'd say. Didn't realize we were curing ourselves. But among the upper classes, the idea was novel, slightly scandalous, and therefore irresistible. Society women began arriving at Cowton's clinic with lace parasols and nervous constitutions. Some came secretly, under aliases. Others arrived proudly, determined to feel something besides the crushing weight of expectations and overstarched petticoats. One duchess reportedly brought her own cowbell. For ambiance, she said. Men, too, showed up, mostly academics, artists, and overworked bankers, hoping to trade ledgers and lectures for the slow rhythm of cut and breeze. And children? Children loved it immediately. They didn't need an explanation. They didn't ask for studies. They simply walked up to the cows, flopped onto the ground, and fell asleep, as if their bodies remembered something the adults had forgotten. Over time, even the press softened. A few newspapers ran glowing reviews, a retreat for the weary mind, where four-legged friends offer more than milk. One editor, who had once ridiculed the practice, published a sheepish follow-up after visiting. I laid beside a Jersey cow named Blossom. I wept, then I napped. 5 stars. The practice gained new names. Pasture therapy. Bovine grounding. The movement. Okay, that one didn't catch on. And slowly the laughter faded, not because people stopped finding it odd, but because they started finding it useful. Because deep down, even the most corseted of hearts wanted what the cows offered. Warmth without judgment, closeness without questions. Stillness without consequence. You sit now in a circle of others, some leaning, some lying down, all quiet. The cows are scattered throughout the field like breathing punctuation marks, each one anchoring a story of subtle repair. You look up, Doctor. Cowton stands at the edge of the pasture, hands in his coat pockets, smiling like someone who's never needed to say, I told you so, because he didn't want to be right. He just wanted people to feel okay again, and standing here. Not cured, not transformed, but quietly okay. You think that's more than enough. Now imagine a different kind of place. Stone walls, high windows, a hallway that echoes when you breathe too hard. Someone just rang a bell, and you're not sure if it means medicine, prayer, or something worse. This is the Victorian Asylum. And if you're struggling in 1860s England, this is where you might end up. Especially if you don't have access to the Cowtons of the world. Especially if your nervousness is no longer fashionable, or your sadness has outlasted polite concern. Inside the asylum, everything is neat, sterile, efficient in the way that only discomfort can be. The chairs are wooden, the beds are narrow, the staff are tired, and the therapy, ice baths, isolation, electrical adjustments, and very long talks about why you should try harder to feel normal. Compare that to what you had earlier today, lying in a field with a sentient rug that smells like sunshine and chews in time with your breath. The contrast is so sharp it almost tickles. And sometimes gentleness looks like cases were nudged into more modern institutions where they could be charted, tested, and reevaluated. The journals stayed behind, though, stacked in a little cupboard, gathering dust, but refusing to be thrown away. Mabel, the cow with the perfect lean-in, lived out her days munching near the willow tree. She was never replaced. Because how do you replace a cow like that? The world didn't mock the therapy anymore. It simply forgot. For decades, the idea of animal-assisted healing was considered quaint at best, outdated, sentimental, something you'd find in the footnote of a footnote, maybe mentioned by an eccentric professor with a pipe and too many cats. But memory is a funny thing. It doesn't vanish. It just burrows. And sometimes when the world becomes too fast again, we remember. In the early 2000s, a small dairy farm in the Netherlands started offering something called kooi knuffelen, cow hugging. Guests, stressed from city life, could spend an hour lying beside a cow. No phones, no pressure. Just proximity. The trend spread quietly, across Europe, across oceans, Japan, the US, a farm in Vermont, a wellness center in South Korea. No fancy branding, just cows, waiting. The world had come full circle. Only now it was a choice, not a prescription. You could book a session. You could bring a friend. You could say, without irony, "I think I need to hug a cow today." And someone would hand you a waiver and point you toward a very large, very unbothered animal. And here's the magical part. It still worked. Not for everyone. Not always dramatically. But often enough, people who hadn't slept in weeks curled up against a creature that never once asked them to explain. People whose anxiety never let them exhale finally did. People who didn't believe in anything except gravity left with something new in their chest, a softness that hadn't been there before. And maybe that's because cows never cared about eras or methods or whether the science would back it up. They just breathed. They just were. And in a world obsessed with fixing and framing and accelerating, their greatest gift remains what it always was: stillness. You lie back again, eyes half closed. The cow shifts beside you, not to leave, just to get more comfortable. The sun is lower now. The air smells like sleep, and in this moment you realize this wasn't a comeback. This was a return, because healing doesn't need reinvention, just remembering. You wake from a half nap you didn't know you started. There's a warmth at your back. A large, slow-breathing presence that hasn't moved in 10 minutes, which, in modern time, is roughly 3 centuries. The cow is still there. You, somehow, are still here. And beyond the pasture, the world turns, but not so fast tonight. Because, believe it or not, cow therapy is back. Not as a curiosity, not as a punchline in a fringe medical journal, but as something real, gentle, bookable. They call it many things now: cow cuddling, bovine therapy, pasture wellness, slow touch grounding. The names change, the language glows up, the websites look like luxury spas with grass stains, but the heart of it? Still the same. You arrive. You take off your shoes. You approach a creature who does not care about your job title, your search history, or your step count. You lean in, and you let go. In the Netherlands, farms report visitors arriving from cities just to press their foreheads against a cow's neck and breathe. Some cry, some giggle, some fall asleep. All of them leave slower. In Japan, the practice is paired with forest bathing and green tea. Guests whisper to the cows as if they're confessing things too fragile for human ears. In Canada, a man with chronic stress found he could finally unclench his jaw, not during therapy, not during yoga, but when a cow named Dottie licked his elbow. In the US, a farm in upstate New York built an entire pasture-side guest house. No TVs, no alarms, just floor mats, warm milk, and cows with names like Mabel, Millie, and Queen Latifah. Some places offer it as alternative therapy. Others market it as luxury decompression. One farm simply says, "Come sit with something that doesn't need you to be interesting." And in a world where being interesting feels like a requirement just to exist, that offer feels revolutionary. There are skeptics, of course. People who raise an eyebrow and ask, "Isn't this just a glorified petting zoo?" To which the answer is, maybe. But petting zoos don't heal you quietly from the inside out. And cows, they don't offer excitement. They offer enough. You shift in the grass again. The sun is now syrupy, melting behind a low hill. The cow beside you flicks her ear. Not at you, just at life. Somewhere nearby, another person is doing what you're doing. Leaning in, letting go, not waiting for a miracle. Just resting in. The ordinary magic of presence. And you realize something. Maybe we didn't need to reinvent wellness. Maybe we just needed to remember that safety isn't a product. It's a sensation. And sometimes that sensation has 4 legs and smells faintly of hay. You've been lying still for so long now, your thoughts are starting to whisper instead of shout. Not gone, just softened. The kind of quiet that happens when your body finally believes you're not in danger anymore. And maybe that's the secret, isn't it? Why it worked. Why it still works. Not because of magic. Not because cows emit mystical healing rays from their nostrils. Though, admit it, you'd believe it at this point. But because your nervous system, old, loyal, and slightly dramatic, is wired for safety. And it doesn't take much to convince it. A steady heartbeat nearby, a large, warm body not reacting to the world, an environment that doesn't ask anything of you except to stay. That's it. And cows? Cows are experts at doing absolutely nothing, beautifully. Let's be clear, they're not emotional support cows. They don't need a title. They don't wear vests or get certified or enroll in bovine mindfulness retreats. They just be. And that's the point. In a world of noise, cows offer neutral presence. They don't try to fix you. They don't mirror your anxiety. They don't suggest hydration or affirmations or 30-day challenges. They don't remind you of what you should be doing. They just stand, 1,000 pounds of mammalian calm, asking only that you exist. Beside them. And for your body, that's enough. Because presence is contagious, stillness is too. There's research now, modern, clinical, peer-reviewed research, that backs up what Dr. Cowton once scribbled in the margins of a notebook under the words theory cow. Things like heart rate variability increases when people lie beside animals. Cortisol, your stress hormone, drops. Oxytocin, your cuddle chemical, rises. Even the temperature of your hands can change. Warmer fingers, calmer mind. But even if you didn't know all that, even if you'd never read a study or downloaded a mindfulness app, your body already knows this. You knew it the moment you exhaled against a warm cow flank and didn't immediately tense up again. You knew it when you closed your eyes and the world didn't follow you in, and you especially knew it when the cow sighed. Long, low, not for effect, and you matched her breath without trying. That's the kind of therapy no subscription service can deliver. So, yes. It worked. It worked for tired seamstresses in the 1800s. It worked for overworked executives in modern cities. It worked for you, right now, on this patch of grass that smells faintly of sun-warmed clover and second chances. Because safety, real, safety is rare. But when you find it, in a room, a hug, or the patient eyes of something big and unhurried, your body remembers how to rest. And that's healing. The field is quiet now, not empty, not even close, but wrapped in that kind of hush that only arrives when everything is exactly where it's meant to be. You're lying on your side. The cow is still beside you, her massive ribs rising and falling like a lullaby written in slow motion. Her breath is warm, steady, grass-scented, and just the tiniest bit damp. But even that feels gentle, like the world itself has a pulse, and tonight, you're synced with it. You're not thinking about what's next. You're not worrying about what didn't get done. You're just breathing, slowly, with the cow. And as your cheek presses into the cool grass, you realize you haven't checked the time in hours. That might be the greatest achievement of the day. Dr. Cowton once wrote, near the end of his life, "I believe the world would suffer less if more people lay down beside creatures who never asked them to change." You're starting to believe it too, because lying here, in this quiet place with no charts, no pressure, no expectation to improve, you're beginning to remember something ancient. That your body is allowed to rest. That peace isn't earned. That breathing slowly beside something unbothered might be the closest most of us ever come to prayer. The cow shifts slightly, adjusting